reach out and pass that message along. It is my honor now to introduce to you the president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust, Joel Newberg, who will have a few remarks to say about Robert Harris, and then he will introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Berenbaum. Thank you.
Thank you. I first met Robert Harris at a Passover Seder in 1964 when I was a freshman at the University of California. And I was adopted by Robert's nephew and invited, being away from home at Passover for the first time, invited to a Seder at their house. I guess the next 4 years, every Passover I spent in Stockton, California, which to me, coming from Chicago, was the end of the earth. And Robert Harris, I only was my friend Steve's Uncle Bob. In fact, after a while, I called him Uncle Bob. I didn't see him again for 15 years after I graduated college. In fact, I worked with him here for 2 years before I realized that Robert Harris was Uncle Bob. He was a veteran of World War II, something that never came up at the Passover Seders. And he was an educator, and he was a person who took on himself a task and never acknowledged that there was any limitation to what energy and determination could do. And he made, I think without Robert Harris, there would not have been an ongoing continuing lecture series here. We found that out when he died, and we tried to divide up the task among 4 people, and we all became exhausted. Okay. Michael Berenbaum. Michael Berenbaum is an unusual rabbi. After last night, I hope he will not become known as the other rabbi that produces Academy Award-winning documentaries. He's an unusual rabbi because he's also been a university professor. He's taught at Wesleyan, Yale, Georgetown, George Washington, American University, and the University of Maryland. When I was looking over the material sent to me by the Holocaust Center in San Francisco and pulled off the internet, I found myself, I guess there's no other way of saying it, I found myself, he was born pretty much exactly when I was born. He graduated college when I graduated college, and he is the president and chief executive officer of the Survivors of the Shoah Memorial Foundation, and I am not. He has accomplished a great deal in reading a variety of magazines about him. I can tell you, well, I'm not going to tell you, but he's won an incredible number of awards. He has he's a graduate of Queens College. He got his Doctor of Philosophy from Florida State University. He's written scores of scholarly articles, hundreds of journalistic pieces, and 11 or 12, depending on what he did the last couple of days. He is a remarkable writer, and this, I guess, because of, or in spite of, having certain learning disabilities which affect the way he approaches listening and writing. He's doing a job, and has done a job, that it's difficult to exaggerate the importance of the need for it to be done. I have to say that I think he graces this podium in spite of all the great speakers that we've had here. And I think one of the criteria for judging him is what other people say about it. This is not, I could read you actually from book reviews that I've written of his, but maybe it's a little better. All of those who want to read only one book about the condition of Jewry in 1990 would do well to choose Michael Berenbaum in his description of contemporary Jewish thought. He sacrifices neither complexity nor lucidity. That's Raoul Hilberg on After Tragedy and Triumph. And I guess most importantly, the impact that he on his students, and I'll just quote one of his students. I guess it would be enough in life just to have had Pearl Bailey as a student. And this is what Pearl Bailey says about Michael Berenbaum. The wisdom I gained from Berenbaum's class is priceless. He is young, aggressive, tough, wise as some sages of yore, as brilliant as a diamond. When class ended, you felt filled, drained, and filled again. He would surge into the classroom as if he had just arrived by Amtrak, put down his bundle of papers, and get started. I'd like to allow him to put down his bundle of papers and get started. He's going to speak to you on the evolution of Nazi policy.
Thank you, Joel, for an overly kind introduction. I really should give equal time. My college roommate is in the audience, Murray Zucker, and he knows me better, so he should get some time for a dissenting opinion. And for those of you who are students in the room, there is a preciousness relationship with college roommates that grows with the years. You may not see each other often, but you damn well know each other well, and you certainly knew each other when. And that really, in an extraordinary way, and I think it's really true, and every one of us who have reached a certain stage of maturity will confirm it. It really has an importance as time goes on and as you travel widely. So when you look at your roommate today and you say, what's going to be 30 years from today, and what are you going to know about me no matter where I end up in this world, you're going to appreciate that knowledge in a very important way. So we'll give Murray time at the end. The other person I'd like to acknowledge is a person who is because he's one of the people who has been designated righteous among the nations of the earth. He was a Danish rescuer, and he rescued Jews during the Holocaust, and that's our good friend, Nu Daibi, whom I've had an occasion to visit here. Let's talk a little bit about the evolution of Nazi policy. And I'm going to talk to it with a certain angle because my own work over the past many years has been dealing with the experience of the victims. And I'm increasingly becoming fascinated, frightened by, but intrigued about the perpetrators. So I want to talk about the evolution of Nazi policy and talk about the perpetrators, touch a little bit about the Goldhagen controversy and fit that into a thorough orientation as to the nature of the evolutionary policies of the Holocaust and also what then makes the Holocaust rescuers and people of enormous importance. We had to the evolution of the Holocaust. We've done so in 30 countries and in 30 languages and in 51 countries. And we've compiled 9 years, 9 months, and 17 days and 13 hours worth of tape material, or enough tape material to circumnavigate the globe, which gives you an idea of the scope of this, and we are in the process of developing the technology to be able to make this disseminatable over wideband video and consequently researchable virtually instantaneously by scholars and students and people interested in creating with this material. So when I tell you that I, in a certain way, have been intensely involved with the experience of the victims, understand that the idea was that the victims have something very unique to tell us about life, about history, about memory, about experience, and most especially with the Holocaust, because the victims teach us the nature of evil in its most particular form. If you want a principle for understanding the Holocaust, understand that the devil is in the detail. And the more details you know, the more you understand the event. Plus the nature, the very important nature of the language that we deal with when we wrestle with the Holocaust makes it imperative to understand the experience of the victims in very particular ways. Primo Levi had said, had the lager existed a little bit longer, they would have had to invent their language. Why? Because I say I'm hungry, it means I missed lunch. You say you're cold, it means you should have really brought a sweater to the lecture. They got hungry in 41, they ate again in 45. They got cold in September, they got warm again in June. And 24 hours, 7 days a week, the reality was that their body was cold all the way through without ever experiencing warmth. And that's why the majority of survivors were Hungarian survivors who only experienced one winter in Auschwitz, not 2 or 3 or 4. So with tremendous interest in the victim, let me now turn to the perpetrator and talk again about some of the very distinct points of Nazi policy and its evolutionary forms. Berg said, if you really want to understand the Holocaust, you really have to only understand 6 words. And if you were drawing a diagram of 6 words, you just have to understand definition, expropriation, concentration. Draw a double line and then speak about Einsatzgruppen, we'll use the English term mobile killing units, and then death camps. Finally, put on the side the word deportation. And in those 6 words, actually I gave you 7 because I didn't want to use the German word for death camps, in those 6 words, you see the entire evolution of the camps and of the killing process, and it will be our task to unpack that as we go through this lecture. Nazis began their policy in one sense by targeting a victim group. First target was the targeting of the Jews involved a very unique definition. Definition of the Jews, which students will know was formed in 1935 with the Nuremberg legislation, essentially defined the Jews biologically based on the religion of their grandparents. Now this is a novum in Jewish history because for the time Jews were defined not by the identity they affirmed, the values they lived by, the traditions they celebrated, the religion they practiced, but by the accident of what was the nature of their grandparents and who they were. Let me illustrate it very concretely. I studied with a great Protestant theologian by the name of Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy. Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy was a great Protestant from 1913 to 1933 in Germany, and an equally great Protestant theologian from 1940 to 1967 in the United States. You don't need to be a math genius to understand that I left 7 years out of the equation. The reason was that for those 7 years, he was not considered a Protestant in Germany, he was considered a Jew. Why? Because his grandparents were Jews. Despite the fact that he was one of the preeminent church thinkers of his day, he was defined biologically as a Jew. Second example, the last building that was left standing in the Warsaw Ghetto was a Roman Catholic church, frequented by Roman Catholic parishioners, with masses celebrated by Roman Catholic priests, serviced by Roman Catholic altar boys, all of whom had the very unique situation of being defined as Jews because of the accident of their birth. Definition had consequences, and definition, in a very extraordinary way, solved a problem. And one of the things I want you to put in the back of your mind is a bureaucracy that once solves a problem doesn't often revisit a problem. I want us to understand that vis-a-vis the killers. I want us also to understand that a little bit later, as I'll touch for one moment vis-a-vis American policy. A bureaucratic decision once resolved doesn't reassert itself unless there's a need for it to reassert itself. And the very interesting thing is the definition of the Jews that was decided in 1935 in Germany became a definition of Jews that expanded wherever the German universe expanded into. In 1938 into Austria, in 1939 into Czechoslovakia and Poland, in 1940 into Belgium and France, etc., etc. And it also became the instrumentality by which other minority groups were defined if they were to be targeted, such as gypsies. And therefore, definition became the first step toward destruction. The second step, Hilberg calls expropriation. One could also call it by the German term of Aryanization. It was the systematic taking away from Jews of the ability to earn a living, to possess property, to live in Germany because they had no means of livelihood. And if you look at the evolution policy, you see essentially that the policy was designed to make it desperately uncomfortable for Jews to live in Germany, in the hopes at first that they would leave. Expropriation was a tool of forced immigration. And what we're learning today is that expropriation, and this is where you have to see the combination of the phenomena of the Swiss banks and of the insurance companies and the French insurance companies, and most especially the German insurance companies, that expropriation, once it's undertaken, continues and develops a logic and a momentum all its own. So part of what we're seeing is that expropriation and the gradual impoverization of the Jewish community not only involved the killers, but it involved all of the bystanders. And it even involved neutral countries, such seemingly neutral entities. And are there more seemingly neutral entities than banks and insurance companies, where we presume that no matter what happens, they protect us and they preserve our capital and our economic situation, and the banks of a neutral country and the insurance companies of neutral and non-neutral, all of a sudden, all of them become involved and entangled with the processes of expropriation. Keep also in the back of your mind one other factor which is intriguing, that the Swiss secrecy laws were originally designed to protect the Jews who were trying to get capital out of Germany and not want the Nazi government to know of it. The Swiss made a good business deal, which essentially they thought they could become the location of capital that was fleeting. They kept that secret. Later, as they joined the policy and the processes, it became a very interesting instrumentality for them to have. Expropriation was designed to lead to forced immigration, except for one very simple problem, is that there was nowhere literally for the Jews to go. In America, the word was paper walls. To come into the United States, we had a quota system, and we also had to fulfill two things. Number one, a certificate of good conduct. Occasionally, you had to get a certificate of good conduct to be issued by the Gestapo. And the second thing that you had was an LPC, likely to become a public charge, which gave the consular officials the ability to make judgments that if you're a physician who possessed what was $50,000 in 1933, which you can multiply by at least 25 or 30 today, and you never worked again, it is likely that someday you might run out of money if your money never again produced any money, and therefore you could become an LPC, and therefore you could not enter. Not only that we had a quota system, Palestine was closed, but in 1938 there was the gathering at Evian, 32 nations gathered, 32 nations said we have a refugee problem. And the tone of the invitation was such in the following way. Nations were told that they would not have to change their laws and they would not have to spend money. All funds for the resettlement of refugees would be from private sources. Palestine would not be on the agenda, and at the conference conclusions what you had was a series of decisions, which is let somebody else solve the problem. Canada said none are too many. Australia said we don't have a racial problem, we're not going to import one. Certain countries were willing to receive farmers and herders, which was not exactly the profession of Jews. Germany, who were urbanized, and the intelligentsia and middle-class business people. The United States was unwilling to budge for all sorts of very legitimate economic reasons, including the fear of the stranger and the immigrant, and growing hostility to Germany and unemployment at home. And in a piece of correspondence in the aftermath of Evian, there was a very dramatic and very important element of place, which is essentially that the German foreign minister wrote of a meeting with the French foreign minister, and he said that all the world, nobody in the world wants the Jew, the only difference between us and them is we're willing to do something about it. Now this would have been a very serious problem had one other problem not entered the fray. And the other problem that entered the fray was that the German universe kept expanding. 1938, Germany entered Austria, 200,000 Jews came under their control in one evening. And therefore, if you wanted to get rid of the Jews and more Jews came under your control in one evening than had left your country over a 5-year period, you're not successful as you expand. When they invaded Poland, 2 million Jews came under German control in a very brief period of time of some 30 days. And therefore, one had to think of a different way of resolving the question. So forced immigration, which was in essence still a discussed policy of Germany, in 1940, with plans to send the Jews to Madagascar to get rid of them and to make Germany Judenrein, did not in part work because the Germans were overwhelmed by the scope of the problem as their universe expanded. Third stage of the game, if you remember, was concentration. Forget about the word concentration camps for a moment and think of keeping Jews together. And if you think of keeping Jews, the form that it took most clearly in Poland was the ghetto. And the ghetto can be seen in two ways. The ghetto can be seen as a holding pen to contain a population until such time as a decision was made what to do with that population. That was not the experience of the victims. It also was not the experience of the perpetrators at that moment, because it only can be seen in its form in hindsight, in retrospect. To the victims, the ghetto was a form of existence. We're going to live here until. And notice I didn't finish the sentence, because the word until this passes, until the war is over, until we die, until. In other words, the ghetto became for the Jews life itself, and for the perpetrators, it became a transient moment, an interim moment of containing these populations until such point as a decision was made what to do with them. And if you play with the word, you can understand that in Poland you had the movement of Jews from small ghettos into large ghettos. You had the deportation of Jews from other areas to ghettos. The idea of ghetto is a holding pen for the perpetrators pending a final solution. And for the Jews, the idea is that was life itself in the form of existence itself until, with nobody really having any clarity what the meaning of until when was all about. And consequently, you have the experience of the victims of trying to figure out how long are we going to be here and what are we going to do here. And one of the ways of looking at the Judenrat is to look at the Judenrat as a municipal government, like the mayor of a small town, with the multiple exceptions of the mayor of a small town and a mayor of a town have to do. The mayor has to provide for sanitation and for jobs and for development and for heating and for food. And the difference is these were not independent municipalities, they were in a dependent situation. And consequently, they took different modalities of being, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But the idea is Jews were going to be together until a decision was made. Thus far, the idea is containment. And then a new idea develops, and there's a debate in the literature now as to whether it develops in the end of 1940, the beginning of 1941. But everybody understands that some decision was reached before the invasion of the Soviet Union. And the decision became later known, articulated very clearly at a conference called Wannsee, which we'll discuss in a moment, became articulated clearly as the final solution to the Jewish problem. Now, one has to say something about the word. We use the word Holocaust, which is a horrendous word. Why is Holocaust a horrendous word? Holocaust means a burnt offering offered whole on. It is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word olah. And the dilemma that you have in dealing with the word Holocaust is, what do you mean offered whole unto the Lord? I don't want to know a God who would accept such a sacrifice. And surely it's not a sacrifice. The word the Germans used was ironically inappropriate and a very truthful one. They used the word the final solution to the Jewish problem. When you have it, what do you try to do? Try to come to a solution. The final solution was the most radical solution, which is you solve it once and for all. And once you solve it once and for all, which is the wholesale elimination in their entirety of the Jews, then what you've done is you've eliminated the problem forever, and Hitler himself was trying to create a museum to an extinct race to celebrate that. That's why you have this incredible collection of Judaica in Prague that fills all of the synagogues of the old city of Prague. And if you're ever in Prague, spend a day, go through that, and understand what it was intended to be. And if you want a piece of advice, Prague has all the beauty of Paris without the Parisians. It's also one of the most romantic cities of Europe, and one of the most romantic cities in the world. And I jokingly say you better go there with your wife or somebody else's. Don't go there alone, but best with your own. And it's really an extraordinary place. June 21, 1941, June 22, 41, the Nazis invade. Germans invade. Nazis did not invade. The Germans invade the Soviet Union. What happens in the German invasion of the Soviet Union is that 3,000 troops go with them. They are called the Einsatz Group in the mobile killing units. Their task is to go to the edge of a city to round up the Jews, the commissars, and the gypsies, and to slaughter them one by one by one by one by one. This is wholesale, and it is an active killing process. Now I want you to understand something, that sociologists use the term clean violence. and with all due respect to Myrna's great profession of sociology, clean violence, in one sense, was the means by which the Germans practiced the murder of Soviet POWs, which is they left them in cages in the winter, and they essentially to death or went at each other, starved to death. And even the ghettos were a form of, quotation marks, clean violence. In the Warsaw Ghetto in 1941, the death rate was 10%. 1 of 10 people died in the Warsaw Ghetto in 41. 1 of 2 of the average population of Theresienstadt died in 1942. And Murray, who's a physician and a very distinguished physician, can tell you what the death rate is compared to the normal death rate for a population. 10% and 50% are unbelievable rates, and therefore, had these places existed for a prolonged period of time, the Jews would have disappeared of their own destruction. And there would have been masses, but the program was to get to active killing. The Einsatzgruppen have now become the subject of this debate. The debate that is taking place is, were these ordinary men or ordinary Germans? This is in essence the subject of 2 very fine, very interesting books. Christopher Browning's wonderful book called Ordinary Men, which is the evolution of one group of Einsatzgruppen killers, and Daniel Goldhagen's very interesting and very controversial called Hitler's Willing Executioners, that speaks of these men not as ordinary men, but as ordinary Germans. The evidence between them, that first of all, the debate between them is an honorable debate among scholars. It has none of the anger, personal anger, and it's a debate over how to read documents and evidence, and whether indeed one can paint the Germans with one single brush, or one look at the evolution of killing and at the processes by which killing becomes difficult and what the hurdles are to overcome the killing. And my own view tends to be more that one has to look not with how easy it is to kill, but how difficult it is to kill and how much one has to overcome one's inhibitions. But I'm in the middle of my own work on this, and we'll see that in a couple of moments. The important point being the Einsatzgruppen went into city after city after city. They round up the Jews. They shot them one by one by one by one by one. The words are places like Babi Yar, 33,771 people killed in a 3-day period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Ponar, which is the death place of the Jews outside of Vilna, Fort 9 outside of Kovno, and hundreds of site massacre. And the difference between the experience of Russian Jews and Polish Jews can be summed up. In Russia, the killing began first, and the ghettos came second. In Poland, the killing only began at the end of ghettoization. And we'll see how dramatically important that becomes. The Einsatzgruppen presented a very interesting way the Jews lived in the Soviet-held territories, empowered the killers to function this way because 90% of the Jews were urbanized. They lived in cities, and they also were assisted, the Germans were assisted by the collaborationist police and by the local population that also wanted to get rid of the Jews. The Lithuanians and the Ukrainians and the Latvians were adept assisting. They had their own purposes for undertaking the killing. And the mobile killers worked effectively and efficiently, but it was problematic. And what was problematic, it's not easy to kill people day in, day out. And there was a complaint to Himmler by one of his officers, look in the eyes of these men, they are destroyed. What are we creating? A nation of savages and neurotics. The killers also report something else. The killers report the fact that they needed vast quantities of alcohol in order to go on the next day. The other problem about this killing processes was it's disorderly. And that is that it is visible, it is tangible, it is perceptible to the entire population, and creates a certain sense of unrest. It is consuming of time and manpower, and I'm using manpower not in a gender-specific way. It's consuming of time and manpower, and the other part is it leaves dramatic evidence, which is in the form of the dead bodies. And the reason we know it leaves dramatic evidence is because there was a program in 1943 to go back to the sites of mass burial, the bodies, and to shred the bones with these big bone crunchers in order to eliminate all evidence of the crime. 1942, January 42, there is a meeting at a beautiful villa called Wannsee. Wannsee is part of Berlin. It's a seashore villa, a magnificent lakeside in Berlin. There were 15 men gathered around the table. The universities would be very pleased to know that 7 of them had doctorates. And they were the key number 2 men in each of the relevant ministries and each of the parties that were associated with the killing process. And if you know the difference between, I come from Washington, difference between the number 1 man and the man in a ministry, especially at that point with the number 1 person, number 2 person ministry, is the number 1 person is the outside person, the number 2 person really runs the department. Secretary of Labor doesn't run the Labor Department, it's the Deputy Secretary. The Secretary of State does not run the State Department, she formulates policy outside. The number 2 person, the Undersecretary, is the guy who runs the department. And you have that way through in government, so when you invite the number 2 people there, you're inviting essentially the people who are going to implement. That was when Heydrich announced the final solution to the Jewish problem. And he spoke of it in very interesting ways. He said, our experience in the East is already providing some practicable experience to the coming final solution of the Jewish problem. What is the practical experience being provided? Number 1, gassing had begun on December 8th at a concentration camp called Chelmno. Number 2, the construction of Zyklon B gas chambers had begun at Auschwitz. And number 3, the idea of resettlement and construction was about to begin. And what happened there essentially was the decision to do something extraordinarily dramatic. It wasn't decided there, it was implemented there. And this, to my mind, becomes the essence of what then becomes known as the Holocaust. If at first you send the killers to the victims, what is the next logical step? Next logical step is, instead of having mobile killers and stationary victims, you have mobile victims and stationary killing centers or killing processes. Now, what was the instrumentality of making the victims mobile? The railroad car. Again, a statistic. Auschwitz had, I read Raoul Hilberg's book on the railroad system, and I learned a statistic. Auschwitz had 44 parallel railroad tracks. I called up and I asked the question, what does a parallel railroad track mean? Each of you could give me a definition of a parallel railroad track, but do you really know what 44 parallel railroad tracks mean? So I used to be a journalist, as Joel had said. So I said, tell me something. I called Amtrak, I said, tell me something, how many railroad tracks, how many parallel railroad tracks are there at Penn Station? Guy answered me, 21. Your Penn Station. 21 parallel railroad tracks at Penn Station. Penn Station can handle about 750,000 people on a busy day. And Auschwitz had 44 parallel railroad. I said, what's the largest number of parallel railroad tracks in the United States? The answer was 49 in Chicago's Stockades. And knowing that particular statistic, you can see in part why Auschwitz was chosen to be Auschwitz, because it was at the juncture of the infrastructure of many different railroad lines. What then resulted essentially is, if you could make the victims mobile and the killing processes, you could achieve enormous efficiency and effectiveness. And that indeed becomes the story that we're about to tell. Let me tell it in a certain way in statistics. There were 3 death camps called Action Reinhardt death camps: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. Belzec was in existence for 10 months in 1942. Killing at its was approximately 600,000 Jews were killed at Belzec in 10 months. Most of you can do the math. That means about 60,000 a month. The staff of Belzec was 104, of whom 14 were Germans, 90 were Ukrainians. Now think of that for just one moment. It means that 14 of your personnel can begin to prevent the killing of 600,000 people, 10 months. Treblinka, 850,000 people killed in 7 months, a staff, in 17 months, excuse me, a staff of 120, of whom 30 are Germans. Belzec, 5 known survivors. Treblinka, not more than 50, 75 known survivors at most. Is what I regard as the epicenter of the Holocaust. And the reason why that when I critique Daniel Goldhagen's book, I do not believe that it's hatred that is the uniquely German contribution to the killing process, but system. And that is, I do not believe it's in the fury, the anti-Semitism, as much in the systemization of the killing that ultimately self without hatred. Let's talk for one moment about Auschwitz. Auschwitz was actually, most of you do not know, Auschwitz was 3 camps in one. Auschwitz was a penal colony, a killing center, and a slave labor complex. They're called neatly Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, Auschwitz III. They're called Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Bunamonowitz. And people who were tell you that they were sent to Auschwitz, you seldom think of it, which part of Auschwitz were you sent to? Let's leave for a moment the penal colony aside. And let's take a look for a moment at Auschwitz II and III, Birkenau and Bunamonowitz. Just a word is nobody invests 700 million Reichsmarks in 1 year in order to make it back that year. They are essentially investing, making a capital investment in building a plant that will be productive over a long period of time. And indeed, if you look at the whole notion of the slave labor complex, what the Germans did was to evolve into a very interesting policy, which is at first they built concentration camps and then tried to get factories to invest nearby. And later they built concentration camps near factories where they had already rented out the labor, because one of the very intriguing things about the SS killing process is it had no budget. It was supposed to be a money-making, not a money-losing operation, and one has to think of the gold as part of that as well. It's that we consume its contents, and then what do we do when we consume its contents? We recycle it. North American slavery, which was evil, pernicious, and horrible, the slave was considered a capital investment. Let me tell you a simple example for students of a capital investment. For most adults, the most important capital investment we make is what? Is our home. For students, the most important capital investment most of you have is your car. What do you learn about your capital investment? What's the first thing you learn about your car? is that you have to give it gas, otherwise what? It runs out of gas. And there's probably no student here and no adult here who didn't once in their lifetime run out of gas, at least once, and indelibly learn the lesson that if you don't put gas in a car, what? It does not run. Second lesson most of us learn about a car is it's fairly wise to change the oil periodically and to service the car, and occasionally even wash the car so it looks pretty good. We then reach a stage in life with a car in which essentially we debate, do we sell it? Do we trade it in? Do we repair it? Or has it reached the stage of the game where we have to do what? Junk it and discard it. Most of us who have not been children of enormous affluence, even those of us who are children of affluence, have watched. If a slave is a capital investment, you feed the slave. You allow the slave minimal amount of shelter and rest. It also is wise to allow it a minimum amount of medical attention. And when you are ready, when the slave is old, you have two choices. You either can trade the slave and get another capital investment, or you can ultimately let the slave wither away. And interestingly enough, if the slave can produce additional capital investment, then procreation is permitted. And one of the reasons you can say that American slavery, however awful and evil, was not genocide is the number of African Americans who made it here increased dramatically once they were here, not because the white men were good, but because the slave was a capital investment, and if capital investment could produce additional capital investment, procreation was thoroughly permissible and desirable. What's the difference between that and Auschwitz? Very simply. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, there was something called selection. Selection was that the old and the very young were sent to die. Women with children were sent to die. The infirm, the ill were sent to die. And only the young and the able-bodied were allowed to enter Buna Monovitz as workers. Working conditions in Buna Monovitz were such that the bottle became emptied because they were not allowed food, shelter, and rest. And once it was emptied, there were other selections. And when there were other selections, you were sent back to Birkenau in order to die. And once you're dead, then what was valuable within the human body was recycled. Gold was taken into the Nazi war economy to make academics feel good. That was a Ph.D. thesis in 1940 in economics that became operational in 1941 in concentration camps. There was a German university that offered a PhD for a thesis on the recycling of dental gold from the dead, done by a very distinguished faculty of economics. The SS then borrowed once the thesis was published, and that became a very important instrumentality for financing the war, because what we've discovered now with the new Swiss controversy was what we long suspected, that Germany was absolutely broke, had no foreign currency, and needed every form of gold reserve in order to finance the war, and that's what Switzerland was there for. The important point being the largest point of it all, which is that in Nazi Germany and in the concentration camp, where they were not death camps but only slave labor camp, most especially at Auschwitz, the slave became a consumable raw material to be discarded in the process of manufacture and recycled into the economy. And therefore, for the first time, the human being became a byproduct of nature, and killing became the instrumentality not only of implementing policy, but of economic policy and of the economic creation. And I remind you that Buna Monovitz was built to last. It was built over the long term, and in a very real sense, Jews were going to be the first, but not the last. One final word as we on the evolution of policy. And then I want to touch on 3 or 4 more side issues, but let me touch on this just for a moment. There's an ongoing debate in literature as to who are the victims of the Holocaust. And that is whether the word Holocaust connotes Jewish victims alone or it connotes and other victims, and what does that mean? When we created the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, one of my unique intellectual contributions was to say that the issue was a bogus issue. That you could not understand the killing of Jews unless you saw it in the context of the killing of the other victims of the Nazis, and that indeed the uniqueness of the Holocaust was in the killing processes toward the Jews, but you could not understand that killing process unless you understood how the Nazis killed other people. Let me give you simple examples so we understand the totality of victimization. Some were victimized for what they did. Trade unionists, political dissidents, clergy who spoke out. Some were victimized for what they refused to do. The best example are the only voluntary victims of Nazi Germany, and those are the Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses would not swear allegiance to the state, they wouldn't register for the draft, and they did something that was socially rather nasty as an act of protest and inner coherence, which is everybody walked into a room and said Heil Hitler, they said good morning. Everybody left by saying Heil Hitler and they said Auf Wiedersehen or goodbye. We'll see you again. There are few words Heil Hitler passed through their lips. And when they were taken into concentration camps, their pacifism was such that they would serve as barbers of the SS in the camps. A position I envied, but not a position that I would be prepared to hold a razor to the throat of a Nazi official and to give him a close shave. I would give him, were I in that circumstances, I imagine, a closer shave than he wanted, and not one that would permit him to come back next month or next day. But their pacifism was so morally integral to their own situation that they could serve as barbers. What made them voluntary victims is what the Jews lacked, which is that if they signed a form renouncing their religious affiliation, they could leave the camps. All you had to do was fill in a half-page renouncing your religious affiliation, and you could leave the concentration camps. And once you think of that, you have to understand something else that we learned, that they had the highest morale in the camps, reported by virtually every victim source imaginable, because they understood why they were suffering. And it had a meaning and a choice. Essential elements lacking in the Jewish circumstances, correct language. There was no persecution of lesbians, there was a systematic persecution of German and Austrian gay males. Why no lesbians? Because in essence, Himmler ruled in 1937 that even lesbian wounds can breed the master race, and therefore there was no persecution. It was considered antithetical to German womanhood. And toward the male German homosexuals, about 10,000 were in, about 10 to 15,000 were incarcerated in concentration camps, and the death rate was about 50%. But there was no systematic killing of homosexuals. It was a matter of death by disease, malnutrition, despair, and hard work, by freezing and the like. But also there was a debate within the German section as to whether the homosexuals were there to be re-educated, namely if they performed with a woman, could they leave, or whether they were there essentially to be punished, and therefore they could not leave. And there were a variety of policies, some allowing homosexuals who could perform with prostitutes to leave the camps. Again, an element of at least the attempt at re-education. The first to be killed were not Jews. And the evolution of gas chambers and crematoria were not designed for Jews. They were originally designed for the mentally retarded, the physically infirm, the emotionally distraught, people who were victims of the so-called euthanasia program. What became interesting is this is the worst of the crimes of the physicians. We all focus on medical experimentations. The worst of the crimes of the physicians were they're participating in this systematic killing, in which during a period of about 2.5 years, approximately 200,000 people were killed in German hospitals. And two things were very intriguing about the killing. Number one, what they had is what the Jews did not have, which is they had a constituency. What was the constituency of the mentally retarded, the physically infirm, the what? Their family. If you have a retarded